Every single family gathering looked exactly the same. My sisters in the living room, drinks in hand, legs crossed, laughing about something that happened at someone's office last Tuesday. And me in the kitchen, cooking, cleaning, wiping counters, checking on things in the oven, arranging the serving dishes in the order they would come out. Nobody came in to help. Nobody looked over their shoulder and said, "Hey Renee, do you need a hand in there?" Nobody said anything at all. Except my mother, who appeared in the kitchen doorway once every 45 minutes or so, not to help, but to check that things were progressing on schedule. At Christmas dinner that year, my mother stood in the doorway with her wine glass and watched me wipe down the counter after setting out the appetizer trays, and she said, "You were always the domestic one, Renee." She meant it as a compliment, the way you compliment a piece of furniture for being exactly where you left it. My Aunt Gloria laughed from the living room. She had apparently heard. I smiled. I kept wiping. About an hour later, my sister Vanessa, who was on her third glass of wine and feeling generous, called out from the living room asking if someone could refill the drinks. She was looking at me when she said it. I refilled the drinks. Because I am not petty. But here's what I want to tell you. 2 weeks before that Christmas dinner, Vanessa had attended her company's annual holiday party. A large event. About 240 guests. A hotel ballroom in downtown Charlotte. Full catering, custom menu, passed appetizers, plated dinner service, dessert station. She had talked about it at Thanksgiving, said it was the best corporate event she had ever attended, said the food was extraordinary, said she had no idea how they found a caterer that good. At Christmas dinner, after I refilled her drink, she looked at me with the particular expression my family reserved for me. The one that was warm and slightly patronizing in equal measure, like you might look at a child who had done something adequate. She said, "Renee, do you know who catered my company Christmas party last week? It was absolutely incredible. You would have loved the menu." I reached into the pocket of my apron. I handed her my business card. She looked at it. She looked at me. She looked at the card again. The living room went completely quiet. 11 people, not a single sound. This is that story, from the very beginning. Before I go any further, I just want to say, if this kind of story is something you connect with, if you have ever been the person in the kitchen while everyone else got the credit, go ahead and follow right now. Because I have a lot more stories like this one, and every single one of them ends with the same quiet justice. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Renee. I am 36 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, that I purchased 3 years ago and renovated slowly, one room at a time, on weekends when I had the energy and the patience for it. My home office is my favorite room. It has a large window that faces the backyard garden and a whiteboard wall that is usually covered in numbers and timelines, and the kind of organized chaos that only makes sense to me and my operations manager, a woman named Deja, who has worked with me for 4 years, and who I would follow into any professional battle without hesitation. I have a cat named Pepper who has 0 interest in being held and maximum interest in sitting exactly where I am trying to work. I cook for pleasure now. Not obligation, not performance, not because someone is standing in a doorway waiting to see if things are on schedule. For pleasure. I own a catering and hospitality company called Cornerstone Events. We serve the Charlotte metro area and have expanded into Raleigh and Greensboro over the last 2 years. We have 43 employees, 11 active corporate contracts, and an annual revenue that crossed $2.8 million last fiscal year. I started Cornerstone Events with $12,000, a secondhand commercial mixer, and a Serve-Safe certification I had gotten on a Tuesday evening after working a full day at the hotel kitchen where I was employed at the time. Nobody in my family knew I was building it. Nobody in my family knew it existed. For almost 4 years. I want to tell you who I was before Cornerstone. Before the 43 employees, and the corporate contracts, and the revenue number that still occasionally surprises me when I see it written down in black and white. I was the middle daughter, the quiet one, the one who cooked. And in my family, being the one who cooked meant being the one who was taken for granted so consistently and so completely that it became invisible to everyone in the room. including, for a long time, to me. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. My parents, Diane and Walter, had been married for 34 years by the time this story reaches its climax. They were a stable, church-going, community-oriented couple who had built a comfortable life through decades of disciplined choices and genuine hard work. My father worked in municipal government for 26 years. My mother was a dental hygienist who had worked for the same practice for 18 years before the practice was sold, and she took early retirement at 61. They were good parents. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the parts that were harder. They were good parents who had simply, without intending to, sorted their 3 daughters into categories early on and never thought to question whether the categories still fit. My older sister Monica was the ambitious one. Monica had gone to UNC Chapel Hill on a partial academic scholarship, gotten a business degree, and spent 15 years climbing through the corporate structure of a regional banking company until she was a senior vice president with an office that looked out over the Charlotte skyline. Monica talked about her work at every family gathering. She had opinions about markets and interest rates and leadership strategies that she delivered with the confidence of someone who had never once been told their opinion was not welcome. My family listened to Monica the way you listen to a keynote speaker. With attention, with respect, with the slight forward lean of people who believe they are in the presence of expertise. My younger sister Vanessa was the charming one. Vanessa had gone to a smaller school, gotten a marketing degree, and was currently a brand manager at a consumer goods company in Charlotte. She was funny and warm, and the kind of person who could walk into any room and within 20 minutes know everyone's name and have 2 of them considering her for their best friend. Vanessa talked about her work the way she talked about everything, entertainingly, with the specific gift of making whatever she was describing sound like the most interesting version of itself. My family laughed with Vanessa the way you laugh with someone who has been making you smile since they were old enough to talk. With ease, with warmth, with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who simply makes the room better by being in it. And then there was me, Renee, the middle daughter, the one who had gone to a culinary program instead of a 4-year university, which my mother had described at the time as a practical choice, and which Aunt Gloria had described as a shame because Renee had always been so smart. The one who had spent her 20s working in hotel kitchens and catering operations and restaurant back-of-house environments that nobody at the family dinner table had any real framework for understanding or valuing. The one who, somewhere along the way, had become the person who handled food at family events. Not because anyone had assigned it to her officially, but because she was there, and she could, and nobody else had stepped forward. And once a thing happens, once it has a way of becoming permanent without anyone making a conscious decision about it. I want to stop here and acknowledge something honestly. I was good at it. The cooking, the organizing, the making sure the appetizers came out at the right temperature, and the dessert table was set up before people finished their main course, and the kitchen was clean enough that my mother could receive compliments about it without embarrassment. I was excellent at all of it. The problem was never the work. The problem was what the work said about me in the language my family used to evaluate a life. In that language, cooking was domestic. Domestic was not ambitious. Not ambitious meant not quite as far along as Monica or Vanessa. And not quite as far along was the quiet verdict my family had handed down about me so gradually and so gently that by the time I fully understood it, I had been living inside it for years. Let me tell you what family gatherings actually looked like, because I think the reality of it matters more than a general description. Every major holiday my parents hosted, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, the occasional summer cookout that my father called a barbecue and my mother called a gathering, and which required approximately 3 days of food preparation and 1 day of setup. From my earliest memory, the preparation had a structure. My mother organized. Monica consulted on timing and logistics from the living room. Vanessa set the table and arranged flowers and handled the presentation elements, which she was genuinely talented at. And I cooked. Not just my dish. The whole meal. The turkey at Thanksgiving was mine. The glazed ham at Christmas was mine. The deviled eggs that Aunt Gloria specifically requested every single time, and which required about 45 minutes of careful preparation, were mine. The rolls that had to be timed precisely so they came out of the oven hot, but not too hot. The gravy, the 2 types of pie. Mine, 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 mine. I am not saying this to frame myself as a martyr. I genuinely love to cook. The act of preparing food for people I love is something that gives me real satisfaction. The creative problem of a large meal, the timing of it, the way each element has to be ready at the right moment so the whole thing arrives at the table in the right order, that is a problem I find genuinely engaging. But there is a difference between cooking for people because you love it and cooking for people because the role has been assigned to you in a way that no one ever questions. And the difference is in the word thank you, or rather, in its consistent absence. I cannot tell you the number of times I watched my mother receive compliments at her own table for food I had cooked. The turkey is wonderful, Diane. The rolls, Carol, these rolls. Your deviled eggs, Gloria said every single time about deviled eggs that had not once been made by my mother. My mother accepted these compliments graciously. She did not correct anyone. She did not say Renee made everything you are eating. She said thank you the way a person says thank you when the compliment feels accurate. Monica noticed this exactly once. She said at Thanksgiving, about 4 years before this story reaches its climax, "Mom, you should tell people Renee cooked." My mother said, "Of course people know Renee helped." Monica said, "Helped?" And then her phone buzzed and she looked at it and the conversation was over. Helped. I had cooked an 8-hour meal for 22 people. Helped. Vanessa's version of acknowledgement was better intentioned and somehow more deflating. She would come into the kitchen occasionally, not to help, but to taste things and say things like, "Oh my God, Renee, this is incredible, you are so talented," and then drift back to the living room like a warm breeze that had passed through and changed nothing. The compliment was real. But a compliment delivered in the kitchen while someone else is still washing dishes is a very specific kind of acknowledgement. It says you are talented at this particular thing that I am not staying to help with. My father was the quietest about all of it. My father was a man of deep and genuine feeling who expressed almost none of it verbally. He showed up in the kitchen occasionally and stood near me in the way that men of his generation sometimes do, close enough to indicate presence but without any clear plan for what to do with their hands. Once, when I was about 27 and had been on my feet for 6 hours preparing Christmas dinner, he stood next to me at the stove and watched me stir the gravy for a moment, and then said very quietly, "You do good work, Renee." That was the entirety of it. 4 words, which were somehow everything and not quite enough at the same time. Aunt Gloria deserves her own paragraph. Aunt Gloria was my mother's younger sister. She was 63, retired from a career in education, and had the energy of someone who had spent 30 years managing classrooms full of children and had never quite learned to turn it off. She loved me in the particular way that people love someone they have unconsciously placed in a supporting role in their own personal narrative. Warmly, consistently, without ever fully seeing the person behind the function. She called me baby in a voice that was equal parts affection and diminishment. She said things like, "Renee, you are such a gem" at the beginning of every gathering, and then handed me her empty plate at the end of every meal without a second thought. She was not a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who had accepted the story my family had written about me without ever reading it critically. I want to tell you about the moment I fully understood the category I had been placed in. It was a Sunday dinner, not a holiday, just a regular Sunday, the kind my mother hosted every few months to keep the family in orbit around each other. Monica had just been promoted, senior vice president. Her company had sent flowers to her home, and her name had been in the business section of the local paper in a small item about promotions at the bank. My mother had printed the newspaper item and framed it. It was sitting on the mantel next to Monica's college graduation photo. During that same Sunday dinner, I mentioned casually that I had just completed my certification as a certified hospitality professional, a credential that had required 8 months of study while working full-time, and which I was genuinely proud of. My mother said, "That is wonderful, honey." Aunt Gloria said, "Renee, are you still at that hotel?" I said yes. She said, "I am sure they are lucky to have you." And then the conversation moved back to Monica's promotion. I drove home that Sunday evening and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a long time. Not crying, thinking. Specifically, I was thinking about the distance between how my family saw me and what I actually knew I was capable of. It was not a small distance. It was the kind of distance that, if you let it, could make you believe that their version of you was the accurate one. I decided that night that I was not going to let it. I was going to build something so undeniably real that the category they had placed me in would simply no longer fit. I did not know exactly what yet, but I knew it was going to involve food. Because food was the one place in my life where I had never once doubted myself. And you build from your certainty, not from where someone else expects you to stand. The idea for Cornerstone Events did not arrive fully formed. It arrived the way most real things do, gradually, through a combination of observation and frustration and the slow accumulation of evidence that something was possible before you are ready to call it a plan. I had been working in professional kitchens since I was 22 years old. Hotel banquet operations, restaurant back of house, a stint at a private club that handled a significant volume of corporate events. And for the 3 years immediately before I started Cornerstone, as an event chef at a mid-sized catering company in Charlotte called Bellamy Catering. At Bellamy, I was the person who designed the menus, managed the kitchen team on event days, and executed the actual cooking. I was not the person who quoted contracts, not the person who met with clients, not the person whose name was on the company invoices. That person was my employer, a man named Dennis Bellamy, who had started the company 20 years earlier and who I will describe charitably as someone who was better at selling the food than understanding it. Dennis's approach to client relationships was excellent. Dennis's approach to food quality was inconsistent at best and alarming at worst. I spent the better part of 3 years compensating for the gap between what Dennis promised clients and what his kitchen team was actually capable of delivering without my direct supervision. After one particularly difficult event, where the main course for a 300-person corporate dinner came out 20 minutes late because of a preparation error that I had flagged 2 weeks earlier in a planning meeting that Dennis had not taken seriously, I sat in the parking lot of the venue at 11:30 at night, loading the last of our equipment into the van, and thought a specific thought. I thought, I could do this better. Not arrogantly, not in the way that people say they could do something better, when what they mean is they could not possibly do worse. In the specific, evidence-based way that comes from 3 years of watching exactly where the gaps are and knowing precisely how you would fill them. I could source better ingredients at the same price point if I built the right supplier relationships. I could design menus that were more scalable without sacrificing quality. I could manage event day execution in a way that removed the variability that had caused that parking lot moment. I could build client relationships that were based on consistent delivery rather than charm alone. I knew all of this. I had been knowing all of this. I had just been knowing it in service of someone else's company. I spent the next 4 months doing 2 things simultaneously. During the day, I continued working at Bellamy, doing my job at the same level I always had, because I believed that whatever you are currently doing, you do fully, and you do well, regardless of what you are planning to do next. In the evenings and on weekends, I built the plan for Cornerstone Events. Not a vague plan, a real one. Projected startup costs, equipment needs, licensing requirements, kitchen rental options, initial target market analysis, pricing structure, staffing model for the first year. I filled 3 legal pads. I built a spreadsheet model that my operations manager, Deja, who I had not yet met at the time, later looked at when she came on board and said she had seen business plans from MBA programs that were less thorough. I needed $12,000 to launch in a way that gave me a genuine chance rather than a desperate attempt. I had $8,000 in savings. I needed $4,000 more. I took a second job on weekend mornings at a bakery near my apartment. Saturdays and Sundays from 5 a.m. to noon. I had done early morning kitchen shifts for years, and the hours did not break me. The $4,000 took 11 weeks. I want to tell you about the day I registered Cornerstone Events as a legal business entity. It was a Tuesday in October. I did it online, which took about 20 minutes and cost $250 in state fees. It was the most quiet and anticlimactic and significant 20 minutes of my professional life. When the confirmation came through to my email, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my laptop screen. Cornerstone Events, LLC, registered, legal, real. I called no one. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table for a while, and then I opened the spreadsheet and moved to the next item on the list, because that is what building actually looks like. Not celebration, not announcement, just the next thing. I want to say something about the decision not to tell my family. It was not made out of drama or spite. I had tried once, early in my career, to share something I was excited about with my family and had experienced the specific deflation of watching people you love receive your news with a warmth that had a ceiling on it. The ceiling was defined by their framework for what was possible for me. And their framework, built over years of seeing me as the one in the kitchen at family gatherings, had a ceiling that was lower than what I was building toward. So I made a practical decision. I would build it first. And then I would let them see it, not as a reveal designed for drama, as a simple presentation of fact. Here's what I built, while you were looking elsewhere. The first year of Cornerstone Events was the hardest year of my professional life, not because of any single catastrophic failure, because of the particular exhaustion of doing everything yourself when everything means the cooking and the client calls and the invoicing and the vendor negotiations and the social media presence and the equipment maintenance and the event day logistics and the post-event follow-up and the next event proposal and the financial tracking and the tax preparation and on in a list that never shortened, because every time you completed one thing, the next thing was already waiting. I did all of it. Alone. For 14 months. My first client was a small law firm in uptown Charlotte that needed catering for a client appreciation luncheon. 40 guests. Simple menu. 2-hour event. I found them through a contact I had made at Bellamy who had moved to a different firm and remembered my work. I quoted the event carefully, not cheaply, correctly. The partner who hired me said my quote was higher than what they had paid before. I said I understood, and I would be happy to walk her through exactly what was included and what the difference in quality would look like. She booked me. After the event, she called me personally and said her clients had asked 3 times who had done the catering. She booked me for their next 3 events before I left the building. I want to tell you about the growth year by year because I think the actual numbers matter. Year 1 revenue, $84,000. 11 events, all small to mid-size. All executed by me with a rotating team of contract staff. I paid fairly and consistently, which meant they came back. Year 2 revenue, $212,000. 27 events. I hired my first 2 full-time employees. Deja came on as operations manager in month 14 and changed everything about how efficiently the business ran. She had a background in event logistics and a specific talent for seeing problems before they became problems, which in the catering industry is worth more than almost any other skill. Year 2 is also the year I got my first corporate contract. A regional financial services company needed a catering partner for their Charlotte office's internal events, monthly team lunches, quarterly all-hands meetings, annual company holiday party. It was a 12-month contract with renewal options. It was not a large contract in dollar terms, but it was the first time Cornerstone Events had guaranteed recurring revenue. I remember reading the signed contract in my car after the meeting where we finalized it. I sat there for a moment. Then I drove to the kitchen rental space I was using and went back to work. Year 3 revenue, $640,000. Year 3 was the year everything accelerated. Not because of luck or a single breakthrough moment, because of the compounding effect of doing good work consistently over time. In the catering and hospitality industry, reputation is everything, and reputation is built one event at a time, and there is no shortcut. I had spent 2 years building mine event by event, plate by plate, follow-up call by follow-up call. By year 3, I had 7 corporate contracts, and a client referral rate that meant I rarely had to actively pursue new business. New business pursued me. I moved Cornerstone out of the rental kitchen and into a commercial kitchen space I leased in year 3. 6,000 square feet. professional equipment, dry storage, cold storage, a proper office for Deja and me. The day I signed that lease, I stood in the empty kitchen space and looked at the stainless steel surfaces and the industrial ranges and the walk-in refrigerator and thought about the second-hand commercial mixer I had started with. Deja was standing next to me. She said, "How does it feel?" I said, "Like the beginning of the next part." She said, "Good, because we have 3 proposals due Friday." I laughed. We went back to work. I want to tell you about what was happening at family gatherings during these 3 years of building, because the contrast is important. Every holiday I drove back to Raleigh. Every holiday I cooked. Not because I had to, not because my family expected me to, but because by the time I fully understood that the expectation was the problem, I had already started Cornerstone and had made a decision that the reveal would come in its own time, and in the meantime, I was not going to change my behavior in ways that would signal something was happening before I was ready. So I cooked. I cooked at Thanksgiving the year Cornerstone hit 6 figures. I cooked at Christmas the year we signed our 5th corporate contract. I cooked at Easter the year Deja and I hired our 30th employee. Every time my mother said you were always the domestic one. Every time Aunt Gloria said, "Renee, you are such a gem." Every time Vanessa drifted through the kitchen, tasted something, said, "Oh my God, this is incredible," and drifted back out. Every time Monica offered a logistical opinion from the living room about when things should come out of the oven. I want to be honest about what those moments felt like, because I think dishonesty about the emotional reality of a situation like this does a disservice to anyone who is living something similar. They were hard, not devastating. I was not breaking down in the bathroom between courses, but hard in the way that it is hard to be seen as one thing when you know yourself to be something else. Hard in the specific way of holding a truth that the room is not ready for and knowing that the room's unreadiness is not your problem to solve. Hard in the way that requires a specific kind of patience that is not passive. It is active patience, the patience of someone who is building towards something and choosing not to be derailed by the smallness of the current moment. I had a ritual during those years. After every family gathering, after the drive back to Charlotte, after I had unpacked my overnight bag and fed Pepper and made myself a cup of tea, I would open my laptop and look at the Cornerstone financials. Not obsessively, just once, briefly, as a kind of recalibration, a reminder that the story my family was telling about me and the story I was actually living were 2 completely different stories, and only one of them was true. By the beginning of year 4, Cornerstone Events was a company that could not be described as a small business anymore, without the description feeling inaccurate. 43 employees, 11 active corporate contracts covering clients in banking, healthcare, technology, and professional services. A client list that included 3 of the largest employers in the Charlotte metro area. Annual revenue of $2.8 million. Let me give you a specific picture of what $2.8 million in catering and hospitality revenue actually looks like as an operation. It means the corporate holiday party for a healthcare company with 480 guests, where every dietary restriction on the RSVP form is accounted for individually, because I built a system for it in year 2, and it has never failed. It means the monthly executive luncheon for a regional bank, where the same 6 senior leaders have been eating our food for 2 years, and 2 of them have requested the same menu item enough times that it has become an informal signature dish. It means the product launch event where the client's marketing team is watching everything because the food is part of the brand experience and it absolutely cannot look or taste like catering. It means 43 people who come to work knowing exactly what is expected of them and delivering it because the culture of the company, which I built carefully and deliberately from the beginning, is one where standards are clear and respected and people are paid fairly and treated well. I want to talk about what I built culturally at Cornerstone because I think it matters to the story. In professional kitchens, there is a long tradition of hierarchy that expresses itself through pressure and occasionally through cruelty. The idea that excellence is produced through stress rather than through systems and respect and clear expectations. I had worked in kitchens that operated this way. They produced inconsistent results and burned through staff and had a particular energy on event days that I can only describe as controlled panic. Controlled panic is not a business model. I built Cornerstone on a different model. Clear expectations, consistent training, fair pay. The understanding that when something goes wrong, which it does in this industry, the first question is what in the system allowed this to happen, not who do we blame. The result was a team that stayed, that learned, that cared about the outcome in a way that went beyond their job description, because they felt like the outcome was partly theirs. Deja once told a client during a site visit that Cornerstone's turnover rate was lower than the industry average by a significant margin. The client said that was impressive. Deja said it was intentional. She was right. The corporate holiday party where everything converged was Vanessa's company event. I had catered it for the first time that year. The contract had come through a referral from an existing client who knew someone at Vanessa's company's procurement team. I did not know Vanessa worked there when we signed the contract. I found out 3 weeks before the event when I was reviewing the guest list as part of our event planning process, and I saw a name that I recognized. Vanessa Chambers, brand manager. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, not anticipation, something more complicated, a kind of quiet recognition. The story that had been building for 4 years was about to have a moment of convergence that I had not planned and had not engineered. I had simply been building Cornerstone. And Cornerstone had been doing what good businesses do. It had grown into rooms I had not anticipated. I made a specific decision about the Vanessa situation. I did not tell her. I did not reach out before the event to let her know her company had hired her sister's catering company. Not because I was setting a trap, but because I believed that the work should speak for itself before the revelation did. I wanted the food to be extraordinary. I wanted the event to be seamless. I wanted the moment when she connected the dots to happen after she had already formed an independent opinion about the quality of what she had experienced. That mattered to me. Not the surprise, the sequence, the quality first, the truth second. The event was on a Friday evening in December. 240 guests. Hotel ballroom in Uptown Charlotte. 4-course plated dinner with a past appetizer reception beforehand and a dessert station that my pastry team had spent 3 days preparing. The menu was one of the strongest we had ever put together. Butternut squash bisque with creme fraiche and pepitas, pan-seared duck breast with cherry reduction and roasted fingerling potatoes. A dessert station centered around a show-stopping croquembouche that my pastry lead had been perfecting for 2 months. I was on site for the entire event, not visible. I was in the kitchen and in the back corridors and at the service stations, making sure everything moved the way it was supposed to move. The event went exactly as planned, which in this industry is never guaranteed and always earned. 2 weeks later, I drove to Raleigh for Christmas. I had my business cards in the pocket of my apron. Not as a plan, just as what they always were. Part of who I am when I am anywhere. Christmas at my parents' house had a specific rhythm that had not changed in 20 years. My father picked up my grandmother from her apartment at 10 in the morning. My mother started her preparations at 7, which in practice meant organizing and directing and checking in on the progress of things that were mostly already handled. Monica arrived at 11:30 with her husband James and their 2 daughters, bringing the wine she had been told to bring and offering opinions on the kitchen layout that nobody had asked for. Vanessa arrived at noon with her boyfriend Derek, bringing the bread rolls from a bakery she liked, which everyone agreed were good, but which were not as good as the rolls I was simultaneously finishing in my mother's oven. Aunt Gloria arrived at 12:15 with a sweet potato casserole that was, in all honesty, genuinely good, and which I had always been careful not to compete with out of respect for the one dish she genuinely made herself. I had been there since 9. The meal was mine as always. Glazed ham that had been marinating since the previous day. Green beans slow-cooked with smoked turkey neck for 2 hours. Macaroni and cheese that my family had eaten every Christmas for 20 years, and which my grandmother once said was the reason she did not mind getting old. Cornbread dressing, cranberry sauce made from scratch, candied yams, a gravy that I had been building for 4 hours, and 2 pies, sweet potato and pecan. The gathering unfolded the way it always did. The living room was warm and full of conversation. My father's jazz records played at a volume that was present but not intrusive.
The children ran between rooms with the specific permission that Christmas grants to behavior that would not be tolerated on an ordinary Sunday. I was in the kitchen. At some point in the late afternoon, after the meal had been eaten and the initial round of dishes had been cleared, and people were settling into the particular post-Christmas dinner contentment that comes from good food and warm rooms, my mother appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me wiping down the counter. She said, "You were always the domestic one, Renee." She meant it the way she always meant it, as a fact, as a compliment, as a thing that simply was. From the living room, Aunt Gloria laughed and said something affirming that I did not fully catch. I smiled. I kept wiping. About an hour later, Vanessa came into the kitchen. She was on her third glass of wine, which was not unusual for Christmas, and she was in the warm, generous mood that the third glass of wine always produced in her. She said, "Renee, this food was absolutely incredible. Like always. You are so talented." I said thank you. She started to drift back toward the living room, and then she turned back. She said, "Oh my God, I just remembered. My company Christmas party 2 weeks ago. Renee, do you know who they used for catering? It was the best corporate event food I have ever had. Like we are talking restaurant quality. The duck was unbelievable. And there was this thing they did with the desserts, this tower thing. I cannot even describe it. Do you know anything about the Charlotte catering scene? Who do you think could do something like that?" I looked at her for a moment. I reached into the pocket of my apron. I took out my business card. I held it out to her. She took it the way you take something when your hand moves before your brain has fully understood what is happening. She looked at it. Cornerstone Events, LLC. Renee Chambers, founder and CEO. She looked up at me. She looked back at the card. She looked up at me again. I watched the information travel through her. The company name, my name on the card, the title, the connection to the event she had just been describing. The duck she said was unbelievable. The dessert tower she could not find words for. Her sister, standing in front of her in an apron. Having just spent 6 hours cooking Christmas dinner for the family, she said, "Renee." Just my name. Like the word itself needed a moment to mean something different than it had meant 5 seconds earlier. I said, "Yes?" She said, "This is you." I said, "Yes." She said, "The Christmas party was you." I said, "Yes." She said, "The duck." I said, "My executive chef designed that dish, but yes." From the living room, my mother said, "What are you two doing in there?" Vanessa did not answer. She was still looking at the card. She said, "How long?" I said, "Almost 4 years." She said, "4 years." I said, "Yes." She said, "Renee, $2.8 million is printed on this card." I said, "That is last year's revenue." She walked into the living room. She did not say anything. She simply handed my mother the card. My mother took it. She pulled her reading glasses down from where they sat on her forehead. She read it. She read it again. She handed it to my father. My father read it. He looked up at me where I was standing in the kitchen doorway. He did not say anything for a moment. Monica said, "What is that?" My father handed her the card. Monica read it with the particular speed of someone who processes information for a living. She looked at me. She said, "Renee, this is a real company." I said, "Yes." She said, 2.8 million in annual revenue. I said, "Last fiscal year, yes." She said, 43 employees. I said, "As of October." Aunt Gloria had gotten up from her chair in the living room and was now standing at the edge of the kitchen, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something between disorientation and something that looked like it might be becoming pride. She said, "Baby." Just that. Baby. I said, "Yes, Aunt Gloria." She said nothing else for a long time. My grandmother, who had been sitting in the armchair near the window the way she always sat, quiet and observant and sharp in a way that age had not touched, said from across the room without moving from her chair, "I always knew you were going to do something like this." Everyone looked at her. She said, "A woman who cooks like that for other people out of love has got something in her that is not going to stay in a kitchen her whole life." I have been waiting to find out what it was. She settled back in her chair. She said, "Now I know." The room was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who do not know what to say. The particular quiet of people who are recalibrating, who are taking a story they thought they knew and finding that it has a different shape than they believed. I stood in the kitchen doorway in my apron. I said, "The pies are ready if anyone wants dessert." And I went back to the kitchen. The rest of Christmas evening had a different quality than any family gathering I could remember. Not tense, not celebratory in the forced way that would have felt performative. Just different. Like a room that has the same furniture in it, but someone has moved the light source and everything looks slightly altered. Monica came to find me in the kitchen while I was serving pie. Monica's way of processing information was to organize it into questions and then ask them in sequence. She said, "When did you start?" I told her. She said, "How did you fund the startup?" I told her. She said, "Who is your operations manager?" I told her about Deja. She said, "What does your client acquisition process look like?" I said, "Monica." She said, "What?" I said, "Can we have this conversation at a normal time? I am cutting pie." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You are right. Sorry." She paused. Then she said, "Renee, $2.8 million. I said, "I know." She said, "I am genuinely impressed." This from Monica, who had 15 years of corporate banking experience and an office overlooking the Charlotte skyline, was not a small thing. I said, "Thank you, Monica." She squeezed my arm. She took her pie. She went back to the living room. Vanessa found me after everyone else had gone to the living room. She came and stood next to me at the counter, and for a moment we just stood there. Then she said, "I talked about that party at Thanksgiving. I said the food was incredible." I said, "I remember." She said, "I was talking about your food." I said, "I know." She said, "And you didn't say anything." I said, "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I told her the truth. I said, "Because I needed to build it first. Before it got filtered through everyone's expectations of who I was. I needed it to be real and finished and undeniable before I brought it into this house." She looked at me. She said, "We made you feel like you had to do it in secret." I said, "You made me feel like your idea of what was possible for me had a ceiling, and I needed to build above the ceiling before anyone knew I was trying." She did not argue with that. She stood with it for a moment. Then she said, "I am sorry, Renee." I said, "I know you are." She hugged me. It was the hug of someone who is understanding something in real time and feeling the weight of what the understanding costs. I held it. Then I handed her a piece of pecan pie and sent her to the living room. My father found me last. This was consistent with everything I knew about my father. He was always last because he needed the most time to find the right words, and he refused to use the wrong ones. He came into the kitchen after everyone else had settled, and he stood next to me the way he had always stood next to me at the stove, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather had a business. Did I ever tell you that?" I said I did not know that. He said, "Small thing, a hardware store in the town he grew up in. He built it himself from nothing and ran it for 30 years. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "He used to say that the hardest part of building something is the years before anyone can see it. He said those years will either break you or make you unbreakable." He looked at me. He said, "You are unbreakable, Renee." I want to tell you that I did not cry. Because I did not. I am my father's daughter in at least this one way. I process things slowly, and I do not perform the processing. But I held what he said. I held it the way you hold something that you have needed to hear for a long time and are not entirely sure what to do with now that it has arrived. I said, "Thank you, Dad." He nodded. He went back to the living room. My mother was the hardest. Not because she was the least kind, but because she was the one whose category I had lived inside the longest.
She came to find me when the kitchen was clean, and most of the family had gathered their things, and the gathering was winding toward its end. She stood in the kitchen and looked at me, and I could see that she was working toward something, moving carefully through a thought that had more weight than her usual thoughts. She said, "I have been thinking about what I said earlier, about you being the domestic one." I said, "Mama." She said, "Let me finish." I stopped. She said, "I said that because I thought it was true. Because every time I looked at you in this kitchen, I saw someone doing what they were naturally suited to, and I never once asked myself whether you were choosing it or whether you were just filling the space we had left for you." She looked at me. She said, "I left a space for you, and I called it who you were. And that was not fair." I looked at my mother for a long moment. She was 61 years old. She had raised 3 daughters largely while managing a demanding job and a household and an extended family that required significant energy. She had done this with very little complaint and a great deal of love, even when the love did not always find the right words. I said, "Your deviled eggs are on page 3 of the Cornerstone catering menu under family style sides." She looked at me. I said, "I have been serving them at corporate events for 2 years. They are one of the most requested items. I changed the paprika ratio slightly, but the base is your recipe." She looked at me for a moment. Then she started to cry. Not the dramatic tears of a scene, just the quiet tears of a woman who had just understood something that mattered more than she had words for. I put my arms around her. She was smaller than she used to seem. We stood in her kitchen like that for a moment. Then she said into my shoulder, "You put my deviled eggs on a corporate menu." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She laughed, a real, full, surprised laugh, and everything that had been complicated between us for years did not disappear. But it shifted into something that had more room in it. Room for the version of me that had been building in Charlotte for 4 years. Room for the version of her that had always been doing her best. Room for both things to be true at the same time. Things changed between me and my family after that Christmas, not overnight, not completely, but in the specific way that real things change between real people when something has shifted the foundation enough that the structure above it has to find a new arrangement. My mother and I talk differently now. She asks about Cornerstone with genuine curiosity, not the performed interest of someone trying to seem supportive, the real interest of someone who is trying to understand something they previously did not make space for. She asks about the corporate contracts, about Deja, about what the expansion into Raleigh looks like. She asked me last spring whether Cornerstone would ever do private family events, and I told her we had a small residential division, and she said she wanted to hire me for her friend Barbara's retirement party. I said I would do it as a gift. She said she would not allow that. We went back and forth about it 4 times before I finally invoiced her at cost. She paid the same day. Monica asked me 6 weeks after Christmas if I would be willing to have coffee with her. Not a family coffee, just the 2 of us. We met on a Saturday morning at a place near her office that she clearly chose because it was comfortable for her, which I found endearing. She said, "I want to understand how you built it." Not in the corporate interrogation way she had asked questions in the kitchen on Christmas, in a more genuine way. We talked for 2 hours. At the end she said, "You are a better business person than you know." I said, "I know exactly how good I am." She looked at me. Then she laughed. She said, "Yes, you clearly do." We have had coffee 6 more times since then. It is the closest thing to a friendship we have had as adults. It turns out we have a great deal in common when we are not performing our assigned roles in our family's story. Vanessa has become my most enthusiastic informal ambassador. She talks about Cornerstone at her company. She has mentioned us to colleagues. 2 new corporate clients came directly from Vanessa's network in the year after Christmas. She does not get a referral fee. I tried to give her one. She said she was not going to take money for telling the truth about her sister's company. I said it was standard practice. She said she did not care. I let it go. But I do send her a dessert box from our pastry team every month. She has never once complained about that arrangement. My grandmother called me the week after Christmas. She does not call often. She says the phone feels like a performance and she prefers letters. But she called. She said, "I have been thinking about what I said at Christmas. about knowing you were going to do something. I said, I remember. She said, I want you to know I was not just saying that. I said, I know, Nana. She said, your grandfather would have been very proud. I did not say anything for a moment. She said, Renee? I said, yes, I'm here. She said, good. That is all I wanted to say. She hung up. I sat with that phone call for a long time after. Cornerstone Events is now in its 5th year of operation. We have expanded our kitchen facility. We are in active conversations about a second location in Raleigh, which would allow us to serve the central North Carolina market with the same operational infrastructure we have built in Charlotte. Deja was promoted to Chief Operating Officer in February. Her title now matches what her actual role has been for 2 years, and she received a compensation adjustment that I hope reflects some portion of what her contribution has actually been worth. We are a company that I am proud of, not just because of the revenue number, because of how we built it, and because of what it costs to build something real, and because I paid that cost and I am still standing. At Thanksgiving last year, I drove to Raleigh. I brought a team, 3 people from Cornerstone who I trust completely. I told my mother I was not going to be cooking alone this year. She said, Renee. I said, Mama, I am going to cook, and I am going to enjoy it, but I am doing it with my people. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. The Thanksgiving meal was the best one my family had ever eaten. Not because the food was better. The food has always been good. Because for the first time in 20 years, I was not invisible in the kitchen. I was present, and the room knew it. And I sat down at the table for the whole meal, and nobody asked me to refill anything. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Your talent does not require an audience in order to be real. The years when nobody in your family could see what you were building were not the years your talent was absent. They were the years your talent was uninterrupted. I cooked at every family gathering while Cornerstone Events was growing into a $2.8 million company. I did this not because I was passive or afraid or without options. I did it because I had made a choice about what deserved my emotional energy and what did not. Fighting the category my family had put me in required energy. Building something that made the category irrelevant required the same energy, directed differently. I chose to direct it differently. There is a version of this story where I confront my family in year 2, where I sit down at the dinner table and say, you treat me like the help and I am tired of it. That version of this story would have been completely understandable. The feelings behind it were real and valid. But that version of this story would also have required me to spend energy on a conversation that was not ready to be heard. Because you cannot argue someone into seeing you differently. You can only build something that makes the argument unnecessary. I want to speak specifically to anyone who is in a family where the roles were written before you were old enough to negotiate them. Where the quiet one means the one we overlook. Where the domestic one means the one we take for granted. Where the one who helps means the one whose help we have stopped noticing. Hear this clearly. The role is not the truth. The role is a story your family is telling. And you are not obligated to live inside their story. You are allowed to write your own. Build in silence if you need to. Not forever, not as a permanent condition, but for as long as the building requires your full attention and the people around you cannot yet see what you are creating. Protect the vision until it can protect itself. And then, when it is ready, hand someone your business card and let them read it and wait for the room to go quiet. I was the domestic one. I was the one in the kitchen. I was the one who cooked while everyone else sat in the living room talking about their careers. I was also the founder and CEO of a $2.8 million company. Both of those things were true at the same time. The difference was in who was doing the seeing. My grandmother said she always knew I was going to do something like this. She said a woman who cooks like that for other people out of love has got something in her that is not going to stay in a kitchen her whole life. She was right. Love is not the same as limitation. And the thing that your family uses to define you is not always the ceiling. Sometimes it is the floor, the foundation, the thing you build from. I built from the kitchen, and the kitchen became a company, and the company became the answer to every dinner table where I was invisible.
Not a loud answer. A quiet one. The best kind. If you are somewhere in this story right now, if you are the one in the kitchen, the one who helps, the one they call the domestic one or the practical one or the one who just needs to find her way, I want you to hear this. Keep building, not for the moment when they finally see it, for yourself. For the version of yourself that knows exactly what she is capable of, even when no one else in the room does. Build in silence. Let the work speak. And one day, when the time is right, reach into your pocket, hand someone the proof, and let the room go quiet. That quiet will be the most satisfying sound you have ever heard. I know because I heard it. In my mother's living room, on a Christmas evening, with my apron still on and a business card in my hand, and 43 employees and $2.8 million worth of quiet truth behind me. They called me the Maid. I was the CEO. And the only difference between those two things was where you chose to look. If this story sat with you the way I hope it did, I would love for you to subscribe. Because I have more stories like this one. Stories of women who built in silence, who worked without applause, who handed someone a business card or a bank statement or a property deed at exactly the right moment and let the truth do what arguments never could. And if you are living a story like this right now, I want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. Not for the algorithm. For the next person who needs to read it and know that someone else is building in the same silence they are. You are not behind. You are not invisible. You are just not finished yet. Keep going.